So,
Isn't it so strange to just like look back at pictures of your kids and you're like,
yeah,
why do I not remember that?
yeah. There's,
Like, man, which I don't know. It's funny.
and
I'll look back at pictures of Jack and I'm like, oh my gosh, I do
I was,
not remember. Like, I want to remember, and I'm
I
glad that I
was,
have pictures
uh,
to remember.
yeah.
But it's like, my goodness, like I don't remember him that little and that like just purely innocent looking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just like it's insane. It makes me feel like life's on fast forward, which it does kind of feel like it is, does
Yeah.
it not? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
ever since, I mean, really ever since I graduated college, it just feels like every year gets a little bit shorter
Yeah.
and a little bit shorter and a little bit shorter.
Yeah. It's like, and this is kind of an army thing that I've come to realize is that it's like long days but fast weeks, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah.
And I mean, just think about it. We're already almost done with June. It's the third
I
week of
know.
June. And it's
I
like,
know. I know. It's crazy.
huh,
Which
no,
hopefully, I mean, with this podcast, hopefully we can reflect on those things and try
yeah,
to remember. So I don't know, but hey, it's time for the Two Chaps podcast. Are you ready for this?
sure. Are
Okay,
you?
I'm ready, man.
All
I've
right.
been. Do you know how long I have been trying to just get a solid podcast going?
Yeah.
Like whether it was the sports thing that kind of fell or the other stuff like this one everyone kind of had that like I don't really know if this is like this one feels right.
Yeah.
It does like the gut feels good on this one. So here we
Yeah.
go.
All right.
Hey everybody,
Uh,
this is AJ and Coleman with a brand new podcast for you called the Two Chaps Pod.
yeah.
Because we are two chaplains from the United States Army Reserve. We actually served together for about 2 more weeks,
Oh, yeah.
a month, but really.
Yeah.
And I have learned a lot from Coleman. Hopefully, it's been reciprocal, though I know that it's not entirely reciprocal. But it has been fantastic. We both write for Uncultured Dad, something that is very pressed upon our hearts to share. And so now we're going to do this podcast called the Two Chaps Pod. And it's just something that has been an outpouring of conversations that have gone on in the chaplain's office
Yeah.
that are going to deal with just about anything and everything life related, faith related, family related. But it's going to kind of have some guardrails. So, Coleman, talk to him a little bit about those guardrails.
Well, sure. So, uh, yeah, it's AJ, Adam. Which one do you prefer to be called? Because that's always weird to me. Because I know you as
I know, I
I,
know, I know.
uh,
Here's
uh,
the thing as far as the internet is concerned, my
mm-hmm.
name is AJ.
Gotcha. Okay.
Any book that I write, any blog that I write is AJ.
AJ. Yeah.
My real friends know me as Adam.
There we go. So, as AJ pointed out, yeah, this is a podcast can be conversations focusing on being men, being husbands, being fathers, and really kind of considering what we've learned in the chaplaincy, through the Army, through our time together there, and also combining that with biblical wisdom. And there are different types of formats that we're considering in going forward with this. The framework that we're thinking of using is really straight from the kind of the chaplain's handbook, I guess.
Yeah.
AR 165, I guess.
Let's not quote
But,
doctrine to him in that way because they'll be like, what?
Yeah. Uh, but as chaplains, there are 3 competencies that we have and 2 capabilities that we are supposed to employ. And the competencies are to nurture the living, care for the wounded, and honor the fallen or honor the dead. The wording changed a little while ago, and I can't remember which exactly it is.
Believe
So
it's fallen.
is it fallen now?
I think they changed it from dead to soften it to fallen
fallen.
a little bit, you know.
So those are kind of like the 3 frameworks that we're using in talking about life, as a dad, as a husband, as a father, as a man, because that's the other side of this is, we're both dads, we're both husbands. Obviously, husband comes first, dad comes second. That's how it should be. But this is also intended for young men and for broader audiences, but definitely, and I talked about this Sunday. I kind of get a little ahead of myself. Talked about this Sunday in my sermon on Father's Day. The sermon was not on Father's Day. It took place on the day that was Father's Day. It was on what we call the first article of the Creed. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, Maker of heaven and earth. And in talking about it, we reflect on what is known as Luther's Small Catechism, and he begins every section of it as the head of the family should teach his household in a simple way. And the point to that is, it is our responsibility as men to lead our families, to lead our households in the truth that God has given to us. And that's really, when we think about giving that truth to our families, that's nurturing the living. They're the ones that are here with us. So it is imperative for us to give that truth, to nurture their souls, to guide their hearts and minds, to cling to this truth and to rely upon it when times get tough. And that gets kind of to the second competency in the chaplain corps, of caring for the wounded. When we think about what we get to do as chaplains, as pastors, as men, period, we are there to care for those who are hurting. In the pastoral role, it is by proclaiming truth, proclaiming the forgiveness of sins, proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ, of his death, resurrection, and ascension, and his coming again, which a lot of people don't hear as good news, but it really is.
Yes.
And that hope that we have in the future, and that hope that we have right now, the promise that he's given to us, especially in those times where we are wounded, where we're hurting, whether our own sin or the effects of sin in the world. And then that's always to lead to that final kind of end state, which, in the chaplain corps, it sounds kind of negative, honor the fallen.
Yeah.
But really, from where we're coming from, where I think we should come from, this has to do with honoring those who have gone before us, particularly the heroes of faith, particularly Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And how do we honor him in what we do? So, and that resides on us as men to teach that, or to, even if we're not teaching it, to make sure that it is happening with our families. And if you're just a single man, an unwed man, without a family, to make sure that that's happening in your congregation. There's a huge, that's the biggest statistic in terms of whether children stay in the church or not, is whether the fathers go with the family to church. And so if the young men...
I saw something like, just not to cut you off, but I saw something like 93% of dads who attend church with their families, like it impacts their children and their faith.
And then the drop-off when it's just one parent or a mother is like 40%. So, there's this huge disparity. But for those young men that aren't married yet, that they are being trained to be those men who will lead their families and who will be faithful to God's word, and deliver God's word to their families, to their wife first, and then to their children. And then in those three competencies, there's the capabilities of, well, what do we do with that? That is provide and advise. And that's kind of what you had mentioned as really falling under the category of discipleship.
Yeah.
And so
for sure.
I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. So for this podcast, like this, one of the things that I think is so important, and is something that, one, I think that we do really well, and hopefully other people will be able to join in with us, which we see when we're at battle assemblies, because people just kind of come into our conversations as it is, right? Like it just happens. Mm-hmm. This is a conversation. This is all this is going, and it's going to revolve around those things: nurturing the living, caring for the wounded, honoring the fallen. because those things do look different in different aspects, right?
Mhm.
Nurturing the living, like, yeah, our first responsibility is to our wife and then to our children. But those are not the only relationships that we have.
Right.
We are in society to be a part of society and to impact society. So how can we also nurture the relationships that we have socially? We actually wrote a post on Uncultured Dad about the 4 domains of growth for men,
Mhm.
right? Physical, spiritual,
Mhm.
emotional, and social. With like social growth and maturity is important, which also falls in line with the Army's standard of health as well, right?
Mhm. Right.
Which is quoted. You can find that on Uncultured Dad. The link to the Army document is there. We're not going to bog you down with Army doctrine, but at the same time, we want to create a space where we can have these types of conversation, because wounded doesn't always look like a battle injury.
Right.
Wounded could be emotional.
Right.
It could be the trauma that you carry from childhood, because maybe you weren't raised by a great man. Maybe there's trauma from that, and there's ways in which we can help maybe speak into or help you in that journey. It's very important. And then honoring the fallen, agree 100%. Like, I'm a history guy. I
Yeah.
taught history. I love history. There's innumerable lessons that we can learn from history. But then I also told you, and I think you agree with this, there's also the aspect of like honoring the fallen is also a legacy issue.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
what kind of legacy are we leaving when we are the fallen,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And so that's important. But for us, discipleship is huge. And that's where providing the religious support as chaplains, advising the command on moral and ethical issues, all gets lumped into as dads and as husbands,
Mhm.
these competencies or these capabilities, right? Of,
Yeah.
of, of providing and advising. And that's
Yeah.
what we do.
Yeah.
And it's why I get so excited about this, because I think
Yeah.
that there's you could run the gamut on anything, like anything that needs to be talked about can be talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And to go back to the wounded part, that is a serious thing to for us to consider. We deal with guys that and women for that
Hmm.
matter that get physical injuries. Yes, but the biggest killer in the army is the mental and the
Hmm.
emotional and ultimately spiritual, because you can't really separate them.
No,
And that's I mean that's the army cannot be 100% religious. It's in our constitution can't
it
be that
should
way,
be.
and it shouldn't be. You're right. But the issues that people encounter in the
Hmm.
army have that spiritual dimension, and that's where you and I, as chaplains, get to come in and try to speak to that. Ultimately, hopefully, get them to the truth, which is Jesus Christ crucified and risen for the forgiveness of your sins. But that's but on this podcast we can freely express
We
that.
can. Yes, we can.
um, and that is I would say that's the first thing to really hammer home, that all of this and all that we're doing, all of our life, the things that we carry out in terms of how we treat our wives, how we treat our families, what we do for them, how we conduct ourselves, all of it centers around this man, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And the reason that is so important is because he is Lord. When we say that, that means everything, the entire cosmos is in his hands.
Hmm.
And even more, he took those hands and had them nailed to a cross on Calvary to pay for the entire rebellion against the Creator. And so,
Cosmic treason
right,
against the king. Yeah.
yeah, and so to ground all of that in that truth, and to say, you know what, life is worth living because He lives,
Hmm.
because He reigns,
Yeah.
and because He has promised to be with us. Uh, that was we had Matthew 28, the what people call the Great Commission,
Hmm.
as a reading a couple Sundays ago, and it was actually what I used as the basis for our chapel
Hmm.
sermon, or chapel service, a couple weeks ago too, and it is just such a wonderful promise that's there, that these are the last words that Jesus gives in the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah.
I am with you always until the end of the age. And it's like, wow, what more could you ask for? I mean,
Right. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be a blast. We like to laugh. We like to make fun of each other because we are not of the same denomination, but
Correct.
we both love Jesus significantly. So there might be some barbs going back and forth, which is
That's
cool.
true.
None of it's an offense. We all love each other
We'll just
equally. Whatever. We're not going to get too deep
yeah.
into that. But
Let's just put it. I'm the right denomination. AJ is working on it. We'll put it like that.
again, no endorser. I'm not working on it. I stand firm on the truths of what I signed on for. But this space, if there was one thing that you could tell to somebody listening right now, what can this space do for them? What can this podcast be for them?
I guess my one word, and I just realize this might be a cliche church buzzword, but I think it is absolutely, it's biblical, is encouragement.
Okay.
That's, that's what I hope we can do for those who listen to us, be it husband, dad, young men or young women who just go, what are these two
knuckleheads talking about?
Right. But I seriously, I think that's it. And I think we live in a culture today, hence uncultured dad, where we are being discouraged of, this is how God created you as a man to be. And that's a beautiful and wonderful thing. And embrace that and live that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's all lived in light of the man, the true. I mean, when we think about, and this does kind of get into, kind of maybe in the weeds of doctrinal stuff, but when we think about who is the most human, most true human that ever lived, was Jesus, because he was without sin, which all other men and women have been infected with. He lived as the most true human. And so grounding it in him as the true man and the Lord, realizing what it is, what gift it is to be given this biologically by God. And then also with that, the gifts that come with it as becoming a husband, and becoming a dad, to be encouraged in those things that these are, and did this, said this on the Father's Day devotion, which you can check out on our social media platform somewhere. Maybe we can put a link in
Facebook and TikTok. It's all over.
Yeah, right. But when asked, what does it mean to be a dad, and I would put husband in there as well.
Yeah.
It is a sacred vocation, a sacred calling. Yeah. It is a blessing. It is a gift from God. And when we believe that, when we take that to heart, that can really change our perspective on how things are going, whether we're in a rocky time with our marriage, whether we're having, some dysfunction with our children, whether, we're trying to figure out how our family unit fits into wherever we're living, whatever we're going through at that time. When we realize this is a gift from God and he's entrusted you with that, with your wife, with your children, with your occupation, wherever that is, to realize, again, going back to that promise, I am with you always until the end of the age. So what would your answer be?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you said encouragement, and I want to get back to the sacred vocation thing, because there was something that I wanted to kind of curtail off of that.
Okay.
But for me, I think the one word or one thing when it comes to this podcast is hope. And it ties into what I was going to say with the sacred vocation thing, because it is 100%, it is a sacred vocation. 100%, it is a huge responsibility that we have been entrusted with these things as men, for our families, our wives, all of that. But it's not easy.
Yeah.
It really is not easy. It's really tough, because there are some days where the tank is emptied. And as you told me one time, and I'm going to steal it from you, it's really hard to pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
And I think being able to fill up cups and provide hope, specifically the hope that Peter talks about that's undefiled and never fades away,
Imperishable.
right?
Yep.
Yeah. Just providing hope, I think, is so that hope and encouragement, hope and encouragement,
Hmm.
hope and encouragement, right? Like
Yeah.
those things, because as your worst day here on earth is gonna suck, and that's okay. It's okay that it sucks. But it's
Hmm.
also okay to admit that it sucks.
Hmm.
And we need
Yeah.
to be real about that. We need to be honest about that.
Yeah.
And we need to also understand that the we need to understand that even though it does suck, we are promised that we're not alone
Exactly.
while it sucks.
Exactly. Yeah. And I would refer specifically on that point to an article that I wrote that's on
There you
Uncultured
go.
Dad um,
If you
on
can't tell,
prayer.
this is two chaps podcast
That's
from
from
Uncultured Dad.
Uncultured Dad.
Like
Right?
it's all tied together.
Right. But on praying, and particularly praying the Psalms in Psalm
Yeah.
88, because that
Yeah.
is one of the things that I think we run into, and this is extremely true in the Army. Um, when you think about in the military in general, but our experience has been in the
For
Army.
sure.
You get trained to such a level that you're supposed to be able to handle all these things. And all of a sudden, when something comes along that is unforeseen, that is, you're not prepared for it, you don't have a plan to deal with it, that it kind of shocks you. And there's, and I've seen this in guys that I worked with previously, there's this breakdown of, well, I'm supposed to be the best at this, or I have shown that I can overcome all these things. Why is this so difficult? And the problem, where that ends up going, is they keep that inside and it just keeps eating at them, versus, uh, you know, actually conversing about it, and especially from the spiritual aspect of it, bringing it to God in prayer and saying, God, this is something, you know, outside of my control, but it's never beyond your control.
Mhm.
Help me to trust you through that.
Yeah.
And that's the importance of continuing to continue to believe that promise.
Yeah.
I am with you always until the end of the age. So yeah, there's that definite, we, and that's what's ironic in some ways. Since we're two, since this is the two chaps
Yeah.
pod, we can talk more Army stuff with it. When you think about our own programs for like SHARP, which is for the sexual harassment and rape prevention program, the EEO, Equal Opportunity program, even suicide prevention program, all of those are geared towards giving people courage
Mm-hmm.
to speak up, to
Yes.
address those issues,
Mm-hmm.
which is just, there's, like I said, there's it's good on the Army that they realize the only way we have to tell our soldiers to talk about these things in
Yes.
order to move forward.
And it's important to note how the Army defines courage. Because it's one thing to say
Yeah.
be courageous,
Hmm.
right? But what does it actually mean to be courageous? Well, a very simple definition that has been posted as our quote of the day. I think on Memorial Day it was. But courage is not the absence of fear,
Right.
but it's the ability to put fear aside and do what is necessary or right
Yeah.
in any situation. Whether that
Yeah.
is the stuff you were talking about, whether that is men talking about emotions or sucky
Hmm.
days, like
Yeah.
that in and of itself is courageous.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think it's important that those
Yeah.
conversations are had continually.
Yeah. I mean, one of, C.S. Lewis is a guy that we tend to quote, tend to talk about, tend to
He's quite quotable.
yeah, he is. I mean, and he's deservedly so.
I literally have a book on my shelf called The Quotable Lewis.
Yeah. So, but I mean, one of the things that he says is courage. Like he talks about virtues and all that, and he says that courage is the highest one because it's every other virtue on there that you can name hangs on courage, having the
It
courage
does.
to carry it out. And I tend to agree with that. So,
So let's do this. We've kind of introduced ourselves in the podcast. We've
mhm.
also both posted a video for Father's Day, kind of getting our faces out there so people are, more aware of what they're looking at, even though,
Might not
personal
be the
preference on
most
that. Yeah, for sure.
right.
Yeah, totally up to the user's call on that one.
Yeah,
But give us a little background, what you do, how you got into the Army.
okay,
Like kind of our military resume and civilian resume would not exhaustive,
sure,
of course, but
sure,
just you know, let them know who they're dealing with. Who are these
yeah,
two chaps that are talking at them about courage and all this other stuff?
yeah. So, we'll start. Maybe we'll go backwards in time. So,
That's fine.
um, Coleman. I'm married. I have 3 children right now, and I serve as a pastor in Southern Michigan. I had 2 congregations actually, and serve in the United States Army Reserves. This is my 16th total year in the Army. 8 of those were active duty. That's what I did before went into the reserves. Before when I ended active duty, I ended my contract on August 2nd, and I started seminary on August 27th of that year. So then 4 years of seminary in St. Louis, Concordia, St. Louis, and got placed in a church up here, and that's how I got my reserve duty up here. Uh, my enlisted time when I was in the Army, I served as a Special Forces medic, and got to jump out of planes, got to see a lot of cool stuff, got to go through some rough stuff too. That was part of my reason for becoming a chaplain. Um, there were suicide was very prevalent where I served, and and again, it was kind of these things that we've been talking about already. For some of the guys, I'm not convinced it would have changed them from what they had determined to do, but there's a part of me that no one should ever get to the point where they don't think they're forgiven for their
Yeah.
sins, and that God loves them and will take care of them, even if it doesn't look like it at that point.
Yes.
That was a huge driving force of going into the ministry, or actually recovering a kind of a call from my younger days to be a minister. I grew up in Kentucky, and was in love with church. Like it was when so a little more personal history. My parents got divorced when I was about 10, um, 10 to 11 years old. And really at that time, the church became kind of a stable point for me. And that was where, my love for Jesus grew. And then as that grew, my love for the Bible grew, and went through some interesting times in high school and college. Um, and I have to commend some of my Baptist and
Yeah.
more fundamentalist friends, I guess. And I know that word gets
It
thrown
does.
out
It
and
gets
is
bastardized. I mean, let's be
yeah,
honest. It has
yeah,
gotten completely bastardized lately.
yeah. But for helping me to see even more clearly what it is that I believe, and not really what I believe, but what
Yeah.
the Bible teaches.
Hmm.
Because that's another interesting, and this could be a discussion later.
It can be.
The only reason I believe is because God said, "Here's the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Now He's going to work in your heart and mind, and listen to my word." And so yeah. So I do have to give credit to some of my Baptist friends for challenging me to actually, if you're a Christian, hold to it. Let's
Yeah.
see, and uh, of course, then I came out on the other side and said, well, I agree with you, Baptist, on a lot of things. You hold a very good high view of Scripture and the inerrancy and infallibility and sufficiency of it, but there's a couple of things we need to, you know. But anyways,
Iron out. Yeah.
yeah. But that's also been the joy of being a chaplain, is to be able to, talk with you about these things, to have these deeper theological discussions
Mm-hmm.
that you might not get with just your average Joe. Or I mean, if you're fortunate that you have good laity in your church, congregation members, whatever, however you call them, that want to discuss these things, that's great. But a lot of them just haven't been trained enough
Yeah.
and to have those types of conversations. So to be able to talk with you and with our other um, members of our entire unit ministry team,
Mm-hmm.
and to have those conversations
Yeah.
have been really fun and beneficial. So yeah, that's basically, yeah, that's kind of my
That's you.
story. Yeah.
Well, mine's a little different. Not a special forces medic by any stretch of the imagination, but um, I've always had an affinity for the military. Whether it's my history background, I was a history teacher in Texas. Let me start over. I grew up in Michigan in a pastor's home.
Mhm.
I went away to college and then came back and worked at that church that I grew up in as the youth pastor for 3 years. Um, and then just needed to set out. And I set out to Texas on my own, got a teaching certificate, and taught history, Texas history of all things. The Michigander teaching Texas history because that's how they roll in the great old state of Texas.
The Republic of Texas.
An entire unit on the Republic of Texas. You want to know about Santa Ana and Sam Houston and doggone any of those, Davy Crockett fighting at the
Yeah.
Alamo, I'm your guy. In fact, I took Jess, my wife, we went to San Antonio one year for our anniversary, and I got to put on the old teaching hat and be like, so let's talk about this, right? Anyway, that's beside the point. I moved back to Michigan when my son was 1 year old, and my teaching certificate had a little bit of a hiccup, so I had to go through the process all again. Was having a lot of trouble finding a job and could not find a job as a teacher in Michigan, except for in one district, which was a terrible district to work in. Just bad leadership. But it was the only job, right? So you end up taking it. Well, it was miserable. It was as miserable as I thought it was going to be. And then one night in November, I still had a resume on Indeed.com, and it was the Army Reserve saying, "Hey, we saw your resume. Would you be interested in joining the Chaplain Corps?" And I was like, "That's interesting," because previous to even moving to Michigan, my study of history is Civil War, World War II, right? I just have an affinity for those two things, a love for the military, all those things. Has always been something that has kind of burned in the back of my mind. Even wrote a book about my grandfather and his two brothers that went off to war in World War II. And I talked to my wife, and she's like, "Yeah, you should do that. That sounds perfect." Yeah. And I was like, "Okay." If she signs off on it, then I'm 100% in, right? For sure. She's never led me astray before. So I signed up, and they lost my fingerprints 4 times. So I had to get fingerprinted 5 times. And then finally got my orders. I took my oath of office in December of 2019, and finally got my orders to our unit to learn under you and another chaplain in February of 2020. When my first drill was supposed to be April of 2020. And we all know there's no reason to relitigate what happened in the past. Right. But my entire first year of military service, unlike yours, which was active duty and hua, right? Was spent behind a computer screen.
Right, exactly.
That was, and we talked about this, one of the first drills that we were actually in person together, where I was like, and I made a statement to you, which you said you had never heard before, when I said, I've just got this imposter syndrome just swirling around my head. Yeah. I'm here, but I'm not really, I don't belong, right? Because I had never put on a uniform. I had never read Army. I had never been to basic, none of that stuff, right? And so there was, for me, this huge, I would say almost culture shock to a certain extent, right?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to go through the Army education online behind a computer screen. It's a completely different thing to stand in a formation in front of your first sergeant and him calling commands, and you're like, I'll just watch what everybody else does.
Right, yeah.
And just fake it until you make it, right?
Yeah.
Because that's life in the Army Reserve.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially in your case, coming in as a lieutenant, that you are going to be called sir.
Yeah.
For and it's like, I don't even know who you guys are. And
So literally that happened to me because I went up to the unit before, like, it was like December before my first drill. I went up to they had like equipment for me and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so I get there and our S1 meets me.
Yeah.
And he's like, he asked me a question and I said, yes, sir. Just out of general politeness,
Right, yeah,
because the Southern in me, for whatever reason, always. And the first words I heard an Army person say to me was, sir, you do not have to call me sir.
Right. Yeah.
And I was like, okay, yeah, a different world. I get it. My bad. It won't happen again. It was just the force of habit.
Yeah. But
I'm learning.
Yeah, and yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, that's the other so interesting thing about the Army is you will always learn, because each position that you move up, each different unit that you're with, all the people, everything is I mean, there's a standard, but there's also peculiarities with each of those things.
Yeah.
Something you mentioned, and I think it's just as culture shock to come into the Army, and that's very true, because and this is kind of part of why I like our the concept of our being chaplains and discussing these things, coming from somewhat of an Army framework, because as we talked about in our question and answer podcast that we did a couple of weeks ago, that we talked about, how does the church kind of fit in with culture, and the church in one way creates its own culture.
Yeah.
Well, the Army is a perfect example. The military in general is a perfect example that you take somebody off the street and you basically try to get them to forget every part of their identity, and then build them up as this person that they are supposed to be in order to accomplish
all they
a
can
mission.
be, right?
Right, yeah.
Which is not the tagline anymore.
Yeah, but it's it's coming back.
Is it coming back?
I think they changed it. Yeah, I think it is be all you can be now. I'm almost certain. You'll have to look that up.
I will have to look that up.
But there is, this sense of, and it's not to say that you lose your complete identity as a person,
right?
But you realize that now you're conforming to something that's greater than you, which there's a lot of strength in that, but there can also be a lot of pressure in that too, because that's, and especially as reservists, where this is not our normal life, in the sense of 24 hours a day, we're carrying out those tasks of whatever we've been assigned. So that is that's a huge difference from where I was active duty, into where I am reserve now. I mean, that's my primary focus in life now is on an occupation side is being pastor at these two congregations. Whereas when I was active, it was my unit, my team. These were the depending on different points, 6 to 8 to 12 guys, that I'm with, and this is the life that I'm leading. 6 o'clock we're on post working PT. Out, and 5 o'clock we're heading home, and we're going wherever Uncle Sam wants to send us. Different, that was my active duty. When I first showed up to the unit, I got word. It was like, all right, our battalion at that time was already deployed to Iraq, and it's like, you got 3 weeks, and you'll be meeting the guys over there. It's like, okay, let's go.
3 weeks is not a long time either. That is not a long time.
Yeah, and so and got over to Iraq. Let's just like. Right after showing up, and was there for 4.5 months. Finished the tour with that battalion, it was a culture I mean, the Army, the military is its own culture, and and for good reason.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be, to use the biblical term, set apart,
Yep.
because you have a specific vocation to carry out that you're not requiring of civilians. And that's a another side of this, that as chaplains, part of the thing that we're trying to encourage in our guys, going back to my buzzword for this podcast, encourage in our soldiers that we talk to, is like, hey, you guys have this, again, noble responsibility to do things that civilians can't do. One of the greatest is kind of an illustration that a master sergeant shared. This is when I was going through SF training, and he said, when 9/11 happened, it was not the responsibility of those in the Twin Towers to defend the country. It's the people that put on these uniforms.
Yeah.
And you have to understand that you're a part of that now. And so it is your responsibility to fight for those people who were completely helpless against that type of stuff. And that's always a key thing to remember as you serve in the military. And that translates also to, as a dad, you're given a certain responsibility by God to care for your family, your wife, and your children. And only you can do that. So anyway.
It's the line from the Tolkien book. I think it's the second book of the Lord of the Rings, where he says, "I don't love the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his strength, but I love them because of who they protect."
Yeah.
Or I love what they protect.
Yeah.
Right? And it's all mindset. It's all a culture, and it's all a part of like creating that own like self-created culture, like we're talking about, right? Like set apart, grounded in truth, which ultimately is what we hope to influence with this podcast.
Yeah.
And hopefully, through the Two Chaps pod, you can learn, you can be encouraged, you can find hope, and we'll all do it together.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But I think that's going to tie a pretty bow on it for us tonight.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
He is Coleman Geraci. He's a chaplain in the United States Army Reserve. I am A.J. Reilly, also a chaplain in the United States Army Reserve. He's actually going up to a higher echelon next, to a regional support group. I'm staying at the battalion level, so there's going to be a lot of stories that we can share here and there, within reason, of course.
Yeah, all right.
All focused on growing and encouraging and providing hope grounded in truth. We will see you guys soon. We will try to drop another episode here in the next week or two. Make sure you check us out. Make sure you subscribe, and we will catch you later.